The saddest thing about the emergence of the Omicron variant is its utter predictability. For months, even longer, public health officials have been warning that as long as the COVID-19 virus can circulate freely and widely, it would change its form, and that those mutations could be more difficult to handle than the original variant. In October this year, former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown predicted just this. He said, "We in the West may feel safe and blessed at the moment because we've had the vaccines, but we may find a new variant that comes out of Africa or Asia where people have not been vaccinated and are not protected, and it obviously isn't susceptible to the vaccines that we have at the moment." The solution was also utterly obvious: to vaccinate the rest of the world, and fast. But that never happened, and the resulting disparities are stunning. Close to 70% of the European Union and about 60% of the United States have been fully vaccinated, and yet only about 8% of people in the world's poorest countries have received even one dose. Earlier this year, this failure could be attributed to a problem of production and supply. But the world is now producing 1.5 billion doses of vaccine monthly. The problem has been one of distribution, or to put it bluntly, of the rich world hoarding vaccines at the expense of the poor. According to the health analytics company Airfinity, by the end of March 2022, the G7 and the EU are projected to have a surplus of 880 million vaccines. And this is assuming 500 million more donations to poor countries are made, and every adult in these countries, the G7, the EU, are fully vaccinated plus receiving a booster. It's estimated that 51 million of the doses stored by Western countries will expire and have to be thrown away by the end of this year if they are not used. And yet they sit stockpiled while the poorest 1.6 billion people in the world have about 5% of the world's vaccinations. This is not a case of global institutions failing. There's an effective mechanism to share and distribute the vaccines worldwide, COVAX, set up by a group of international health organizations. But rich countries have been stingy about actually making donations. The US pledged the most, 1.2 billion doses, but so far has delivered just about 280 million. The EU, Iceland, and Norway have collectively pledged about 500 million doses and delivered about 112 million. China has recently increased its pledge to 850 million, up from 100 million, and it has delivered about 89 million. As a result of all this, dozens of countries are at risk of falling short of the WHO's goal of vaccinating 40% of every country's population by December 2021. Which means that the virus will keep replicating and mutating freely among billions of people. What is the chance that we will not see another variant in the next year? Vaccinating the world would be good for the world economy, which mostly means the richest countries that dominate it. In May of this year, the IMF released a proposal that calculated that vaccinating the world by 2022 would cost $50 billion. But a failure to do so could cost the world by 2025 $9 trillion. Put another way, an investment of 0.06% of global GDP could have a 180-fold return on that investment. COVID and public health are not the only areas where we see a self-destructive nationalism at work these days. The hot economic topic is inflation and what is causing it. The Biden administration's COVID relief spending is often blamed for triggering it, and it has almost certainly played some role. Strikingly, though, we see rising inflation almost everywhere, including in countries that did not spend freely after the pandemic. So what could explain this global inflation? Well, protectionist policies like Trump's trade war with China and Biden's Buy American. Former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers wrote, "Tariff reduction is the most important supply-side policy the administration could undertake to combat inflation." The connection between rising protectionism and inflation is obvious. For the last 3 decades, countries have been aggressively sourcing goods from across the world because they are cheaper. Once they began reshoring, finding domestic supplies, and putting in place versions of Biden's Buy American provisions, they are paying more for those same goods. Add to this supply chain disruptions and sudden increases in demands for goods, and you have inflation rising everywhere. Just last week, the Biden administration doubled tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. So far, the rhetoric of nationalism has been cheap. But as countries have turned that rhetoric into policy, the costs are mounting. They're being felt by the poorest in the world, and they will hurt the working classes in rich countries the most. The answer is obvious: greater global cooperation in public health, trade, and more. But will any national leader dare to say this? Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column. And let's get started. You heard my take. Now let me bring in Fatima Hassan. She is a human rights lawyer and the founder and director of the Health Justice Initiative in South Africa. Fatima, welcome. Let me begin by asking you, I know that the president of South Africa, and I think you have been critical of the travel bans that have been put in place by many countries, including the United States, toward people coming out of South Africa. Is it not fair as a way of trying to prevent the vaccine spread, even though it is obviously not going to work perfectly, but isn't it fair to in some way try to stop the spread? How do you think about it?
Thanks, Fareed. So we don't think it's fair because the way in which it's been imposed is quite uneven. And a lot of the responses in the last few days really just smacks of a very knee-jerk way of dealing with this pandemic. It goes against the solidarity that was promised to us at the beginning of this pandemic. And, you know, if you see some of the responses from countries like Canada, as well as the UK and also the US, in the last 72 hours, we just feel that it's really bedeviled with racism in the way in which the application of the travel ban is being imposed to basically isolate most countries in Southern Africa and Africa in particular, but not to impose the same kind of restrictions or measures on countries from the north where the variant has also been discovered. We've just heard that Canada won't even accept a PCR test that's conducted in many parts of our world. So, you know, really there's a sense of people being really angry and enraged at the way in which the US and the UK and countries like Canada in particular are actually applying this particular travel ban for this particular variant.
And do you worry that it will have a chilling effect on other countries, alerting the world to the arrival of a new variant? Because what happened in South Africa, as I understand it, and in Botswana, scientists were very open, very transparent, and immediately told the world, "Look, we have this new variant."
We are concerned about that, and obviously the scientists in South Africa and Botswana should be congratulated for not acting in a secretive way, for sharing information in a timely manner. The chilling effect, you know, the concern that we have in relation to that is that it may deter other scientists in other parts of the world. There's currently a debate in South Africa about how much information we should be sharing with the rest of the world. But the more concerning thing is that it's leading to vaccine hesitancy, because there is a sense amongst the communities in which we work in that if our vaccines are not going to be accepted, some of us are fully vaccinated, we've had a double shot of the Pfizer vaccine, if that is not going to be accepted for the purposes of traveling to the global north, if our PCR test results are not going to be accepted, then communities are saying, why bother? Why should we vaccinate if we are just going to be isolated and if we are not going to even be allowed to enter your jurisdiction?
There is a larger problem, though, is there not, with vaccine hesitancy? And I wanted to ask you about this because in South Africa, for example, at one point the government said, stop shipping us vaccines, we have enough. The problem was not enough people were getting the shots. Is the vaccine hesitancy about, more broadly, about kind of hesitation about Western medicine? Is it being influenced by the anti-vax arguments and propaganda coming out of places like the United States?
So I think the answer to that is slightly more complex, because I think the percentages are misleading, and we've seen a lot of worrying reports in the past few days basically saying that the reason why we have this variant is because people in Africa don't want to be vaccinated. In fact, recent studies and data show quite the opposite, that there's a greater willingness to take the vaccine and greater vaccine uptake in parts of our world where we don't have sufficient supplies, where we have been drip fed with vaccine supplies than people in parts of the global north. And certainly there is a combination of vaccine hesitancy because we're dealing with a fast-moving pandemic. Information is shifting on an almost weekly basis. There's been stop-starts to our vaccine programs because of issues around the data or the clinical efficacy of certain vaccines, but it's been made much harder and infinitely harder because of anti-vax movements that basically are quite functional and quite alive in the US with local chapters here too, and that is making it more difficult. So the longer it takes for us to even get first shots into people's arms in Africa, you have more time for both hesitancy and the anti-vax movement to escalate some of their misinformation and disinformation. Remember that in the last 4 months, Fareed, more booster shots have been administered in high-income countries and parts of the global north than even first shots in Africa. So time really is against us, and I think the emergence of the new variant and what we've been dealing with in the last week shows how self-defeating it is to vaccinate most of people in the global north with booster shots and not even to prioritize first shot for most people in Africa. Only 1 in 4 healthcare workers in Africa have been vaccinated, and yet for over a year now there are safe and effective vaccines on the market that could have been used to actually protect our frontline.